I'm conducting the first and the third conversation, but it's going to be a pleasure participating in all three conversations because, as Payal so eloquently put it, they're all linked. When we talk about history, because my first speaker with whom I will have this conversation is a historian, my first speaker is somebody who is so young that I find it almost hard to explain to you that he writes on history. Always we have this feeling about history that's about the past, so somebody senior who's seen part of it at least writes about it. Here we have someone who is still to complete the third decade of his life on earth. And he has been so prolific. He has produced 3 wonderful books and thousands of articles. And apart from that, he has lived a very interesting life, and we will put all these aspects in our conversations. I invite now to join me on stage here our first speaker, Manu Pillai.
I'm sitting here in guzzling warm water, so youth is, very relative to lots of other parameters. All of you enjoy your drink, while I watch.
Well, he studied in London, and from experience, I can tell you that is a happy time in a happy city. So if you're having hot water right now, it's just an aberration, not the norm. So I mentioned earlier that he has written 3 books. What I forgot to mention that his very first book got him the Sahitya Akademi's Yuva Puraskar. Now this is really one of the most well-deserved, young man.
Thank you.
This is one of the most coveted national awards. And so I'd like to begin our conversation today by referring to that book. It's been described as one of the finest, highly researched, most readable writings on the Travancore family. Tell us about that. I mean, tell us how you got the name, how you got the idea, and how you felt that you would be well suited to write about a matrilineal society.
Yes. It's funny that we have, I think, the 4th in line to the title of Maharaja of Travancore in the audience. I don't see him, but he's here. The Travancore royal family, partly because I was fascinated by the matrilineal system. In my own family, we'd study in school. I grew up in Pune, so you'd study in school about widow remarriage and how Indian women were just desperate to be saved by either Indian men or white men from abroad. And they were just sort of, languishing like that in great discomfort and without any agency or any power. And then I'd go every summer to my grandmother's place in Kerala. And there we would get a very different picture of the past. My great-great-grandmother in the 1880s was divorced. She married a man who was also divorced. Both of them were divorcees in the 1880s. These are Savarna, upper caste, Sanskrit-speaking, landlord families that they come from. And they had this most interesting marriage where they absolutely did not like each other, but for some reason they kept at it and didn't divorce each other. He abandoned his first wife and his child from her because he wanted the second one's property. She was first deeply in love with this Brahmin, and they had this wonderful marriage. But, she got pregnant, and she had a baby. And then the man came to fetch her after the confinement and after the delivery. And then when he arrived, he was stopped at the threshold of the house. And he was said, "Don't come back here again." The baby was a girl, and it was stillborn. And in a matrilineal family, the death of a girl is a bad omen. Yes. When girls are born, you send out drummers to announce it to the whole village. When boys are born, nobody really cares. And so the death of a baby girl was a bad omen, and therefore this Brahmin was told never to come back there. And even when we were growing up, there was this little rock where they said that he sat on that and wept for a whole hour to ask to see his wife one last time. But he wasn't permitted. Then she marries this second man. Again, the matrilineal system has lots of complications, which is that he has to come and stay in her house.
Yes.
She doesn't go to his house. He comes and stays here, which means that often his ego is affected by the fact that all the land and the money belongs to her. So he, for example, had this throne of his, which was really a canopy bed, a beautiful carved canopy bed. And it was his throne. It was his favorite place. He used to lord over there lying like that, and the villagers would come and pay homage and that sort of thing. And this wife, my great-great-grandmother, her favorite way of annoying him was to round up all the children she could find, douse them in oil, and get them to play in the mud and all of that. And once they were sufficiently filthy and dirty, to get them to come and play on his bed. And then every time this man came back and saw his beloved throne destroyed like this, He would pull off the sheets, sit on it, summon his nephews from his house, and they would lift him by the coat and take him to his house in this massive procession. And then his children would go and plead, and then they'd bring him back and all of that. The funny thing, though...
Just 1 second. This is reality,
This
not
is reality.
fiction.
No, it is not fiction.
Okay.
In fact, they were married for about 33 years. And towards somewhere in the middle of this, a messenger arrived from the house of the first Brahmin she was married to. And that messenger came and said, he's passing away, he's about to pass away, he's dying. He wants to see, her name was Kunni, so he wants to see Kunni one last time before he dies. Now, obviously, she hadn't seen him in decades, even though he was her first love. Her husband was, flabbergasted that his wife's first husband's representative had come asking to see the lady again. So the lady said no. Great-grandmother said, no, I can't go to see my first husband. But for some reason, this man who had this strange relationship with her, not a happy marriage, he said no, he was your first husband. He clearly, after all these decades, still loves you. So if you won't go, I'm going to send our children. So 3 of their children actually went all the way, saw this dying Brahmin by his deathbed, and finally came back from there. So when we think of our ancestors, we often think that they were these wonderfully monochromatic people who had pious thoughts all day long. They were just leading these lives where they chanted Sanskrit shlokas and they sort of lived these wonderful, perfect lives with not one foot put in the wrong direction. But that's not the truth. Yeah. The fact of history is that human beings have made history. And necessarily every human flaw, prejudice, every human weakness, every human strength, everything is manifested in history. It is not merely about us doing everything or ticking all the right boxes. People in the past also often got themselves into soups and into funny situations and strange places.
But there was no social media where you had to write complicated relationship,
Well, if they had it, they would have written.
They were honest enough to do that. Yeah. So your first book, which was The Ivory Throne Chronicles of Travancore, that opened the window into intimacy and details and the way of life in a sort of royal setting. Your second book, which was on rebel sultans, which is the Deccan, 13th to the 17th, I think it was, the 13th to the 17th century, looked at a far more complex scenario because you had Hindu rulers, you had Muslim rulers, you had combinations that would happen, change, alter, power would change hands, and the whole... It was like a chessboard that was constantly moving. And it had the Mughals in it, and it had Shivaji in it, who you tell us that his name is spelt not the way we spelt it, but the Dutch spelt it with the G-I. He has an eye for such little details, and we would have just passed it by, fascinated by the story that was being told, but he stops momentarily to point to the interesting facts that we may have missed. And so if I had to describe his writing, I would say he has an ability to find the story that we don't know and tell it in a manner that keeps us engaged, including new facts that get added to our knowledge. So in this complex sort of chessboard, how did you get interested? It's a total shift, from Travancore right here. And remember, you don't have those many years. I mean, you've just been there for not even 30 years.
Well, reading has no limit, and I spent most of my time in archives and libraries, and that could be up to 10 hours a day, which is stressful in its own way and isolating in its own way, and rather difficult when you're not an introvert. But, I enjoy reading, so it works out well. The chessboard is, in many ways, I think, representative of this country itself, especially at a time when everything is either black or white. And people say that, no, but, truth is gray and it's somewhere in the middle. I would say it's not even gray. It's actually a mosaic of colors. It's so colorful and so patterned and so rich and layered. That is what makes Indian history so exciting. And the characters that are there, you refer to this religious aspect. When we think of a sultan, we're thinking, okay, this is an Islamic king. Now, the Adil Shahs of Bijapur, for example, from day one, they were a union of a Persian man who was an immigrant from Persia, came here because he didn't have any prospects in Persia. So he thought he's a military professional, he thought he'd come to India and find work here. Somewhere on the ship, it's like ship Brahmins of later days in the 19th century, where somewhere on the ship he decided to concoct a genealogy for himself. And all kings have done this. Hindu kings have also concocted genealogies for themselves, linking themselves to the sun and the moon and that sort of thing. So he says, I'm actually a long-lost Ottoman prince. There was a rival who was trying to kill me, and so my mother gave me away to a merchant, and the merchant raised me, and here I am, landed up in India. Becomes a very successful warrior here, then goes on to marry a Maratha woman. She's the sister of a Maratha ruler. Now, you would think she was some kind of a trophy of war, she was sort of given to him, again, had no agency, she was just there in the harem or something. But no, together this Persian-Maratha couple launched this Adil Shahi dynasty, where you have some kings who privileged the Persian side of their family, and some kings who privileged the Maratha side of their family. So the second of the Adil Shahs was all Persian. He was Shia, he only spoke Persian, he didn't even feel Indian. But later you have someone like Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who is technically a Sunni Muslim, but calls himself son of Saraswati and Ganapati because he's deeply in love with Hindu religion, Hindu thought, and so on. He goes to the extent of renaming his capital Bijapur as Vidyapur for Saraswati. He's this colorful man who speaks only Marathi. So, there's one point, there's a Mughal ambassador who comes, and, Persian is the language of diplomacy, Persian is the language of culture and sophistication and that sort of thing. And this man comes to Bijapur and he's aghast that the Sultan speaks in, raw, proper Marathi to his courtiers. And he reports this to the court in Agra about all of this. And you again see human quirk in all these characters. So, Ibrahim at one point is finally defeated by the Mughals, and the agreement is he has to give a daughter to the Mughal harem, to one of the Mughal princes, son of Akbar. And then he says, okay, fine, send an ambassador and I'll send the bride with him. Once the ambassador comes, what does Ibrahim do? He starts bribing the ambassador. Starts giving him a few lakhs every year just to delay an agreement.
The departure.
And this continues for 4 years. About 3 or 4 years, there's no princess to be seen. There's no marriage to be had. And finally, Akbar gets very frustrated and he said, look, I'm sending a new ambassador with explicit orders not to spend more than one night in Bijapur. So this man comes, and this man is very close to Akbar. He's part of Akbar's Dini Ilahi religious experiments and group. He's like a disciple to the emperor. So he comes, and Ibrahim first tries to stall him on the way. About 2 weeks before he reaches, he says, oh, sorry, Ibrahim is very busy with all kinds of state matters. He's not in a position to receive you, so please stay. So this man, puts down his camp, and he's waiting for news from the Adil Shah, who then bombards him with biryani and dancing girls and every kind of distraction he can find, conversationalists, whatever. Finally, the nobleman says, look, this is not going to work. I'm coming to Bijapur no matter what. He comes, one night passes. The next morning he says, where is the princess? I have to leave. And Ibrahim says, well, why don't you stay a little longer? Here are some presents, this and that. And then again, this man says, absolutely not. I have to leave. And then Ibrahim says, oh, what's this thing you've pinned on your clothes, on your tunic? And it's a Dini Ilahi badge. So Ibrahim says, can I have a look at it? And he takes it. And then he says, okay, I'm keeping it. And then he just sort of, walks off. And the Mughal ambassador has no option but to leave because he's been given explicit orders to leave within 1 day. He leaves, and then he has to stop outside Bijapur to demand his badge back because he can't go back to court without the badge. So again, Ibrahim sort of delays the thing for another few weeks. Finally, his daughter goes off with this man. Midway through, the daughter tries to escape and run back to her father. She has to be captured, taken to the banks of the Godavari, and presumably forcibly married to the Mughal prince. There's a lot of wealth of just human quirk in this. In my third book, there's this character called the Italian Brahmin.
Yes.
This was an actual Italian in the 17th century. Comes to India in 1604, and he's come as a missionary. He's come to convert people to Christianity. He's related to several popes. He's descended from a Holy Roman Emperor, very aristocratic family in Italy. His name is Roberto, and he comes here, and he, goes off to the mission in Madurai. Now, he discovers that in Madurai, the mission's been around for 15 years with a success rate of 0. In 15 years, they haven't managed to convert anybody. So he says, look, I'm going to become a Hindu to save the Hindus. Which is what he starts wearing saffron robes and a saffron munda. On a daily basis, goes around topless like all South Indian Brahmins or South Indian men did at that time. At one point, he acquires a sacred thread like a Brahmin. He learns Sanskrit, he learns Telugu, he learns Tamil. He starts preaching the Bible as the 5th Veda.
The long-lost Veda.
The long-lost Veda. He pretends he's from a lost branch of Italian Brahmins. And by the end of his life, he's had tremendous success. About 4,000, 5,000 people have converted. Every time he goes to royal courts, like a Hindu guru, they will receive him by washing his feet, putting out a leopard skin for him to sit on, and that's how he's treated. And he becomes this Hindu Brahmin, this Italian Brahmin, who's Hinduized entirely his message of Christianity. And you can still see the effects of that in Catholicism in Tamil Nadu, which is that they still, their processions of the Virgin Mary are like Devi processions with chariots and tom-toms and all kinds of...
flowers and incense and all the Hindu
and Mary is sort of
thing.
wrapped in a sari and things like that. It stems from there. But when we're taught history, who would have thought, who was taught to imagine in 17th century Madurai an Italian going around as a gundu and a sannyasi. It's just not a picture we're taught to conjure up, but it is a fact of life. Just as in the Deccan there were black begums, and people don't know that there were black women as queens in a city like Ahmednagar, but they were.
So you talked about when we were taught history, who would have imagined, but we are not taught all this in history. So what is your message to those who are working on the education system? Do you think history has something to teach us, or is it just something that we should know so that we know who we are better?
Both of these. I'll just give you one illustration. You know, a year and a half ago, there was the big Me Too movement that began then. And, you know, Me Too picked up and everybody was, talking about it. It was all over the press. But Me Too was not, for me, it was immediately a parallel from the past that came to my mind. In Kerala, in the early 20th century, in 1905 or so, 1903 or 1905, around then, there was a Brahmin woman called Savitri, locally called Datri. Now, one fine day, Datri is discovered to be in an adulterous relationship. So, Nambudri Brahmin women were the only women in Kerala, not even Muslim women in Kerala, were in Parda, but Nambudri women were. They weren't allowed a proper education. They weren't allowed a life outside the four walls of the women's section in every house. Their movements were highly restricted. And somehow this woman was in an adulterous relationship with somebody else. So they say, oh my God, this has happened. There must be a trial. So she says, fine, but the man should also be tried. And they're like, fine, she's there. They've got her with some man, so let's try the man also. Except she produces a list of 66 men. There's a list of 66 men this Brahmin woman in this Orthodox Nambudri family in Kerala produces in 1905, 2 of whom have died, so that's 64 down. And this includes people from all over the place. It includes 2 mahouts in her husband's house. It includes her father, who sexually abused her when she was younger. It includes her brother-in-law, who abused her at the age of 10. Now, when people say things like, oh, child abuse is a very new thing, it's a result of westernization, no, I'm sorry, there's archival evidence about this lady who was, her hands were laid upon her by her brother-in-law when she was 10 years old. There's a famous star of Kathakali in Kerala. At that time, these were like film stars of the day, Kaungal Shankara Panikar. His name comes up. And all these men are given a chance to interrogate her and sort of, counter her charges. And so they'll go up to her and they say, we deny your charges. But then she'll say, no, but on that day when that festival happened or the sun was in this particular astrological calculation or whatever, that's when we did this. And more importantly, she was able to pinpoint specific marks on their bodies that she remembered.
Which is, by the way, half the time that trials happen, or sexual kind of trials happen.
She had proof, essentially. 66 men, just imagine that. And the story goes, of course, it's a story. It has no basis in fact. But the story is that by the time she reached 64 names, it had caused such a scandal and such great figures had fallen that the Maharaja of Cochin, who was supervising all of this, he said, enough of this, end this trial, it's done for. And then apparently the story goes that he stopped the trial then because his name was next. But what is interesting is this was the first time this was covered in the press. So the Malayalam Manorama archives in Kerala give you actual coverage of this event. And there's this one striking quote that always stands out, which is where they say she replied like a barrister. People say that she went out there to claim power for Nambudiri women and all that, which is a bit exaggerated when you see that it started at the age of 10. But it is true that she knew that at some point she was going to go down because society frowned on Nambudiri women having anything to do with men who were not their husbands, who were often decades older than them. So she knew that at one point she would be caught, but she decided that she was going to take all these 66 men down with her. And that's what she did. And it's just, to think that this happened in 1905, and again, we have parallels of this happening now. That's the one thing that you learn about human character. History is, it is about the past, it is about politics and many other things, but it is also about human character. And the basic fact that no matter what era you live in, you can always count on human stupidity, because human beings don't change.
I think this story is a rather motivational story. I think if anybody is sitting on the fence today, they might take inspiration from her, Savitri, right. So I find you also being able to pick up some really sensitive stories, again, that can be motivational. And in my reading of your work, one of the stories that I was really fascinated by, and I felt good really after reading it, was the Malik Amber story. How you bring in race so effectively, and something we don't study, we don't, acknowledge the fact that we've had a very close association with the African continent and people from that continent. And Malik Ambar's story is a very strong story that you have recounted beautifully. So talk to me a little bit
The
about
African
that.
presence is actually, it's across time. So, Razia Sultan, the famous female ruler of Delhi, one of the charges against her was that she was having an affair with an African associate. I mean, whether it was true or not, the point is he was a major factor, because even in the Delhi Sultanate at that time, there were Africans.
Can I just interrupt for a second? If any of you have seen the movie Razia Sultan, that's the role that Dharminder plays in it, by the way.
What?
Yes. See?
How on
This
earth?
is the age thing.
Well, that's a bit of a shock, but yeah.
Hema
And then,
Malini is Razia, and Dharminder plays the role of Yaqub.
well, not appropriate today in any case to do that kind of
he
makeup.
did
but-
blackface, yes.
There you go. No, but then, so you find them that there was people in Uttar Pradesh, in a place called Jaunpur. Uttar Pradesh residents today are perhaps not aware that Jaunpur had a Habshi dynasty. Habshi comes from Abyssinia,
Yes.
Ethiopia. There was a Habshi dynasty that ruled in Uttar Pradesh and Jaunpur for a long time, nearly a century. In Bengal, in the 15th century, briefly, there was a short-lived African coup that tried to topple the sultans and seize power. In Gujarat, if you go to Ahmedabad, one of the most beautiful mosques there was constructed by an African general. Malik Ambar, of course, is perhaps the most charismatic of these figures. He was 2 generations before Shivaji in the Maharashtra heartland, in the Deccan. He was born in the Oromo tribe in Ethiopia. At about the age of 10, he was kidnapped and taken by these slave traders. He was sold to somebody in Baghdad who gives him the name Ambar. He was Chapu, he becomes Ambar, converts to Islam. At some point, he's shipped off to Goa, and he's bought on the Konkan coast by the Peshwa of the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. The Nizam Shah is the king of Ahmednagar. The Peshwa himself is a black man. So Malik Ambar lands here. He's among 1,000 slaves owned by the minister of the king, and the minister himself is black. And Malik Ambar quickly becomes a warlord. He has a band of about 300, 400 people with him. The Mughal invasion creates a space for him to really grow. Mughal invasion means the kingdom is collapsing, it's imploding, the nobles are fleeing. He starts gathering troops, and he becomes the face of the resistance. So he brings up a little infant Nizam Shahi prince and installs him as a puppet ruler, and he becomes the man who stands in the way of the Mughals. He gets his daughter, again, a black girl, married to the prince of Ahmednagar, the Nizam Shahi dynasty. And then you find that the Mughals for the next 25 years can't get anywhere into the Deccan for the simple reason that this man erects essentially a wall across the Deccan. And he's the one who first starts something called Bargigiri, or guerrilla warfare, which Shivaji later perfects and uses very effectively against the Mughals. Malik Ambar is the one who set up a new city in a place called Kirki, which we now know as Aurangabad. And to honor his Maratha associates, his Hindu associates, this black Muslim general named different suburbs of the place after these Maratha generals of his. Malik Ambar's right-hand man was a man called Maluji. And who was Maluji? Shivaji's grandfather. Later, Malik Ambar was served very well by Shivaji's father, Shahji. And then, of course, Malik Ambar, because he causes such frustration to the Mughal emperors, they've got, in Jahangir's diaries, he's called that pathetic man, that disastrous man, the black-faced man, and things like that. And at one point, Jahangir is so frustrated that he can't defeat Malik Ambar that he commissions a painting in which Malik Ambar's severed head is sort of impaled on a spear, and he's shown taking aim with a bow and arrow at this head, which is essentially the Mughal emperor fantasizing in art about something he could never accomplish in real life. Fake news, a propaganda art of the time. And Malik Ambar dies very secure in his fortress, it's a grand old age of 80-something. And after that, of course, his son is not up to the mark. Shahji, Shivaji's father, tries to keep the state going for some more time. He's also defeated. And the richest tribute paid perhaps to Malik Ambar, this black Muslim, is in Shivaji's court. Once Shivaji becomes king, he commissions a Sanskrit poem called the Shiva Bharata. And in the Shiva Bharata, you have Shivaji paying homage to Malik Ambar, saying he was as brave as the sun. When Malik Ambar is shown battling the Mughals, it's compared to the god Kartikeya trying to kill the Asuras, surrounded by all the other gods. Here, all the other gods are replaced by the Maratha generals, including Shivaji's father and grandfather, and Malik Ambar is in the position of Kartikeya. Even in terms of religion, we often think that these historical figures lived in some universe where religion was their only guiding principle, which is frankly not true. Shivaji, for example, is portrayed as this champion of Hindu pride. He did talk about something called Hindavi Swaraj, which was his kingship. As a king, he had to articulate his ideas in Sanskritic ways and so on. But that did not mean he came from a society that was polarized in any way. Why was Shivaji's father called Shahji and why was his uncle called Sharifji? Because his grandparents couldn't have children for a long time. They went to a saint and the saint blessed them and then they had their 2 sons. What was the name of the saint? Shah Sharif. He was a Muslim Sufi, and to honor him and his blessings, they named their son Shahji and the other son Sharifji, from Shah Sharif, the name of a Muslim. So Shivaji's father was named after a Muslim saint. So you get a sense of, where society was at that time in terms of multiple influences, where a black African was there, where the Nizam Shahs of Ahmednagar are descended from Brahmins who convert to Islam, marry Persian brides, marry black begums, and these kings of Brahmin descent, because they're Shia Muslims, they all send, except one, they all send their bodies to Karbala in Iraq to be buried. I mean, think of the patterns that are emerging. It's a cultural situation in these courts that is extremely rich and diverse and pluralistic. There are multiple influences at play.
So, Manu, I want to ask you a question that has, you've come straight to that point. There has been a book on Shivaji, which was banned, and the poor scholar has been treated very badly. He's from Minneapolis, Macaulayesque College. How come your book did not evoke those kind of reactions?
Don't give people ideas.
No, I don't want to give people ideas. I think everybody here has come with a serious purpose, to participate seriously. God, no, please. Anyway, so why is it that this selectiveness happens? Why does it happen at all? This is a fact that it was about keeping up your kingdom. It was about power. It was not about religion. You explained it very well when you said he needed to describe kingship patterns in a particular manner, in a manner that everybody would understand. So for his Hindu audience, he created this language. But we know how closely there were no polarizing lines. There were no polarizing lines then, but those who are reading the books today, or maybe not even reading the books, or just hearing the story, have much to say about it. Do you not feel that you need to make a strong statement against it?
No, the thing is, you just need to highlight stories from the past. They speak for themselves. You don't really need to go out there and categorically make claims of your own, because the stories supply that in adequate quantities and volumes. Now, since we're speaking about Shivaji, in my book of essays, the second essay is on his nephew.
Yes.
So the Marathas are a fascinating set, because Shivaji, of course, worked in Maharashtra. But after his time, you start seeing them fanning out into different parts of India. So Shivaji's half-brother comes and establishes a Maratha kingdom in Tanjavur. Now this is already a diverse court in the sense that the king is Marathi-speaking, the subjects are Tamilians, his generals are Bundelas and Afghans and people from the up north, and the court language, the language of court is Telugu, because Telugu has been elevated to a very noble position during the age of the Vijayanagar emperor, so Telugu is the court language. So this Maratha prince, Shivaji's nephew, who comes to power in 1684, somewhere in the early 18th century, writes a play. It's a Telugu play called Satidana Surumu, or Take My Wife. It's a parody of the caste system. Now, what is happening in this play? There's a Brahmin called Morobhatlu the Magnificent. And Morobhatlu and his disciple are on their way to a temple festival. And somewhere on the way, Morobhatlu in the distance sees a very beautiful woman. So he says, hold on, I must go flirt with that lady. And then the disciple says, no, you're a great Pandit, you're a great Shastri. Think of the subtle meaning of Vedic words. He says, no, I don't want insipid eternal bliss. I want the bliss that comes with spending a night with this lady. So then this disciple says, my guru's gone crazy. Anyway, can't stop him. So they go to the lady. Lady turns around and she is an untouchable. She's a Madiga, which is a leather-working caste. That's the community she comes from. So first she says, oh no, sorry, I can't talk to you because I'm married. So he says, no, that's okay. Give me your loins like you give a Brahmin a donation of land. Then she says, oh no, but I'm so low in caste in comparison to you. So then he says, no, these things were created by us Brahmins to hoodwink people, so you calm down and just spend your time with me. Finally, she says, but we are very low caste people, we drink liquor, we eat beef, so we're not pure enough for you. So he says, well, I drink cow's milk and I worship the cow. You eat the whole cow, you must be purer than me. Now, this is being said by Shivaji's nephew around, in the early 18th century. If a writer were to use this line today, you can imagine the kind of trouble it would cause. In fact, the other day there was an interview in the Times of India that they did with me, in which they said, which one is your favorite essay to write? So I gave this one as an example. And I got early in the morning, I wake up and I see a notification in my Instagram. This man who's written saying, oh, I saw your interview, that just because you had your mother's milk, are you going to eat your mother as well? The funny thing is, this actually appears in the play, the exact same line. Because the disciple says, he mutters on the side when this conversation's happening. He says, it doesn't mean you can eat up your whole mother just because you have the milk. So it's just funny that, these kind of parallels exist. But the point is, Shivaji's nephew, this Maratha king, who did have a kingly identity in Sanskrit, in Sanskritic terms, who was orthodox in many other ways, he was capable of laughing at himself. He was capable of parodying social conventions. He was capable of turning a mirror and sort of highlighting our own social hypocrisies. We are able to laugh at ourselves when we are confident of our culture and we are secure in our identity. Insecurity is what breeds over-piousness about history. Over-piousness and this sense of our ancestors couldn't do anything wrong. It comes from a place of insecurity. Our ancestors had that sense of security. We've lost it. That is why, so I don't need to say this. The story illustrates this like that. It is Shivaji's direct nephew through his half-brother. So people may say it's not direct, but it's around the same time, early 18th century, in an Indian language, not corrupted by any foreign forces, Western ideas. It's also this was also a play. It was performed year after year after year in a temple festival. People laughed just as this audience did. Because that was the kind of freedom they had in some ways back in the day.
Even in every performance, in every traditional folk performance in any of the forms, swang, you had a character called a Vidushak who would make you laugh but draw your attention to the ridiculousness of things like this. So I just want to mention that this book that he just referred to, the third book, it's really got an interesting title, Courtesans, Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. It's a set of very interesting essays and stories, a lot of them like this, which pick up things that sort of we should know about so that at least we can counter some of the ridiculous arguments that are being made of one language, one color, or everything in black and white, when Manu has very effectively said it was not black and white, it was not even gray, it was multiple colors. Let me now move you a little bit out of the books to the rest of your life. You did your master's in international relations. So how come this passion for history?
Well, the passion was always there, but as you earlier mentioned textbooks and school teaching, you've seen how history is taught in our country, and I was very keen that I would keep it as a minor rather than as a major subject. So I majored in other subjects, economics and international relations, those were my subjects, and never really studied history formally except when I started doing my research for my first book. So the passion was there, but precisely to keep that going, I thought I shouldn't study history in college, in India at least, which is why now I'm doing my PhD in a historical subject. So, hopefully that will make up for.
So it was, oh my God, really? God. All right. You have worked with Sunil Khilnani on the Incarnations Project, which is a BBC project in which the history of India is told through the lives of 50 people. So when I read his last book, which is the Courtesan Mahatma book, I got the feeling that there was something similar. You were telling stories through people. How was your experience with Sunil Khilnani?
It was great fun. I think that was one of the things that I learned, which is that there's often a lot of pressure to sort of stick to your usual heavily footnoted kind of history books. But I've realized that on the one hand, we can't complain that people aren't reading history if we are not going to make history accessible. I think especially if we're complaining that history is being perverted and misunderstood and misinterpreted, it is the duty of historians then to also communicate what they're doing. That research that you're doing needs to be taken out of the seminar circuit and taken to larger audiences. Merely complaining that people aren't reading isn't going to help because the world is changing. Gatekeepers are falling by the wayside. The internet is changing the dynamics of everything and how knowledge is circulated. And we therefore need to respond to that. I think that was the idea. And the stories make it even more interesting. And I think if anybody has an interest in storytelling, it's very difficult to try and suppress that. Yeah. Even small things like social conventions and customs. We take the world so seriously. And then you realize that one thing that history teaches you is that these things collapse very quickly. The things that we give so much value to and fight over and kill people 100 years from now, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't really change. I'll give an example and end with that, because you also began with my first book on the matrilineal system. One of my great, discoveries, as it were, when I was working on the book was in the royal family of Travancore. Again, because it's matrilineal, the Maharani's husband is not the Maharaja. He's only called the consort. Similarly, the Maharaji's brother or son, they are the Maharajas. So basically, the family is not man, wife, and children. It's brother, sister, and sister's children. Now, this obviously means the Maharani's husband is not royal. He's an aristocrat, he's a nobleman, but he's not her equal. So back in the day, the Maharani's husband cannot sit in her presence. He has to remain standing unless he is asked to sit. He cannot call his wife by name. He has to call her Your Highness. Jay from the Travancore family is here. I remember talking to his mother, who said that her grandfather always referred to her grandmother as Highness, never by name. When there were feasts in the palace, the Maharani was served 4 varieties of dessert. Her husband got 2. Every time the Maharani entered or left the capital, she'd get a 21-gun salute. Her husband got a rifle salute because nobody really cared. Even in terms of death, when a consort had no business dying in a palace, because palaces were for royalty to die in. You may be married to the queen, but you are not royal yourself. You may have fathered the next generation of royal princes and princesses, but you are not royal yourself. So when you're dying, you're lifted with your cot and taken to die in a private building or an outhouse because you have no business dying in the palace. And the queen and her children will not attend the husband/father's funeral because he may be their husband/father, but he's still a subject of the state. And royalty never attends the private ceremonies of private subjects of the state. Now, this was taken extremely seriously. This was how it was. In fact, in the 1910s, when Jay Varma's grandmother started driving in the same car with her husband, she got a note from her uncle, the Maharaja, saying, "How dare you do this? This is a massive breach of protocol. If your husband is seen sitting next to you, it suggests equality. He must follow in a smaller car behind you. He can't be seen in the same car." And she was considered this radical reformer because she allowed her husband to sit in the same car with her. The Maharani's full title was Her Highness Shri Padmanabha Sevani Vanchi Dharma Vardhini Raja Rajeshwari Maharani Puradam Tirunal Setu Lakshmi Bai Artingal Mutadamuran, Senior Maharani of Travancore and Companion of the Crown of India. Her husband is simply Mr. Ramavarma Valyakoil Tamburan. He's not a highness. He's not, at most he'll get a Shri. This was taken extremely seriously. There was a whole court protocol built around this. Every time the Maharani came down from the first floor to the ground floor, her 100 servants had to bow to her, not 6 times, not 8 times, exactly 7 times. There's this huge protocol created around this. And then independence comes. Suddenly, the terms of engagement change. Everything changes. In 1949, the state is merged with the Indian Union. That ceases to exist completely. 1956, when the commies are elected into power in Kerala, this palace, where this Maharani had all this protocol around her, with her 300-odd servants and all of that, her own servants form a palace union and they put up a red flag on the palace roof. It took less than a decade for that once power slipped away, this whole fiction and legitimacy you create around power, all these institutions, all this drama that is constructed around power, quickly collapsed like a house of cards because the real substance had gone. And that is always how the world evolves. We fight over things that are frankly irrelevant and pointless. But that is what human beings do. All through our history, we've never learned from our past mistakes. And hopefully, if we read more history, we'll understand at least to stand at a little bit of a distance, take a pause, breathe a little bit and say, okay, hold on, this is not the end of the world. We can think bigger. We can think in larger terms and a larger context.
This has been a fascinating conversation. There is so much still that we could talk about, but I think we have a very nice conversation coming up. I particularly enjoy listening to Manjari, and she's going to talk about the Courtesan project, so you may have some interest in it as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asha, by the way, and thank you to the audience for your patience and for listening. Thank you.